the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
Welcome in. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here. I am Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. Thank you again for listening. Well, it's been a whirlwind. Monday night, very late, had a quasi-important fantasy football auction, as important as such a thing can be, which, face it, not that important, but hey, it's fun. And we're going to talk about that later in the show. Also, just want to thank all of you for being so nice. Follow us on Twitter at Harris Football. Boy, we've gotten a ton of great feedback on the show, and it warms my heart. It's great to know that so many of you are sticking by us as we engage upon the little podcast that could. You've also rated us on iTunes and written a bunch of really nice reviews. And as it turns out, Scott Walker, no, not that Scott Walker and not that other Scott Walker, sent an email, heyharris@harrisfootball.com, saying that maybe I need to branch out a little bit because it isn't just iTunes that matters. I mean, if you're not a Mac person, if you're not an Apple person, maybe you get your podcast, maybe Google Play or Stitcher or something like that. And if that's where you get your podcasts, I'd love for you to rate us and write a review there. Anywhere, wherever you get your podcasts, it would be super awesome if you would give us a nice rating and write a nice review. It definitely helps as we try to grow the little podcast that could. Let's get right into today's show.
Today's kickoff.
Fortunately, as of my recording this, there weren't too many huge injuries for us to talk about. We'll talk on a possible signing. Then I'm going to get into 5 players who I think some folks are viewing as sleepers, and I officially do not. So 5 players that, well, I'm probably staying away from at their current prices, who other folks are viewing as sleepers. And then I'll bring in Jon Anik of UFC fame, and also a good friend of mine, a former partner of mine at ESPN, and a person who participated in last night's auction, La Liga Lebowski, a dynasty league. I will tweet out the rules to La Liga if you're interested in them, and we'll get a sense of what he thought of the auction last night, but also, I think more importantly, kind of a way for us to just be thinking about strategy in auctions in general. Some of the thoughts and strategies that occur to us when we're in the auction room. Remember that on Wednesday, we'll actually have an entire show devoted entirely to auction strategy and to auction players.
Injury news.
I'm not sure whether this is actually under the heading of injury news, but what the heck. The Arizona Cardinals had been dealing with a hamstring injury for Andre Ellington. Apparently he's back at practice. Rookie David Johnson now has a hamstring injury. He's going to miss some time. But what I really want to talk about is the rumor that the Cardinals have made an offer to Chris Johnson. They've apparently not been happy with their running back situation and thinking that they needed to add to their depth. And anytime CJ ? gets mentioned, you know that there will be some fantasy folks who want to jump on that bandwagon. I'll just say what I saw from Chris Johnson last year. Now, I'm not going to say he's completely done, because I don't think he is in terms of straight line speed. There were times with the Jets last season that Chris Johnson found a hole and exploded and had a 20-25 yard game, but there were way too many times where he kind of floated in the backfield and just got tackled. It feels like over the past few years, his negatives from his heyday have sort of been accentuated and have taken over his overall game, which are, he's not particularly tough. He's not particularly somebody who fights for yards or tries to make something happen when nothing's there, which is a shame because the acceleration does still seem to be in those legs. But boy, it's tough to see him as a fantasy contributor in Arizona as part of a platoon. I'm very doubtful that he would wind up winning that job outright. So from a fantasy perspective, I don't think if he does sign in Arizona, Chris Johnson's going to be anywhere near fantasy relevant for me in a 12-team league. And we can just view him, if he did become part of a rotation, as an unfortunate drain for Andre Ellington. All right, so now I want to move on to something I'm calling 5 non-sleepers. These are, maybe they should be anti-sleepers. They're players that other folks are viewing as potential bargains, and at their current price, I would not touch with a however many foot pole that you'd be in possession of. My first non-sleeper isn't going to surprise anybody who listened to one of our running back preview podcasts. It's LeGarrette Blount of the Patriots. I could talk about how his average draft position is currently in the 5th round of a 12-team draft. And I don't have him going until like maybe the 7th or 8th. That's where I would consider him. In the case of Blount, though, for me, it isn't just about value. I just don't think he's good. I said it, like I mentioned during our running back preview. I see in Blount a big guy who wants to run like a little guy, who doesn't get tough yardage when you need it, who's a fantasy front runner. He'll get you a 150-yard game when the Patriots are already up 20. But he's sure as anyone to get stuff from the one when you really need it. It's a touchdown-making offense in New England, and I get it. Since he's been back from his conditioning problems in training camp, there are reporters who are gushing over how wonderful he looks, and I get it. In his career, Blount has 18 carries from inside an opponent's 2-yard line. On those carries, he scored 6 times. He's 250 pounds. I do not trust LeGarrette Blount. That's setting aside the fact that he's suspended for week 1. Listen, you talk about an unsentimental team when it comes to running backs. That's the Patriots. I don't imagine that they'll have a lot of patience if Blount winds up not being the guy. I'll take anyone given the right value, but I promise you this, that I'm not going to get Blount because my value for him is a lot lower than other people's. I do not agree with the idea that he's a sleeper. Next up for me is Julius Thomas. He's coming off back-to-back seasons with 12 receiving touchdowns. Everyone covering the Jags says, oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe the kind of incredible athlete this guy is. And he is. I mean, I'm not going to debate that. 6'5", 250 pounds. There's not a more dangerous dude in the NFL in the red zone. However, I will call him formerly Orange Julius. He's going in the 6th round of 12-team drafts on average, which is treating him like a clear-cut second-tier tight end. Is he a clear-cut second-tier tight end this year with Jacksonville? Well, he's always hurt. He's coming to an offense that had 43 red zone pass attempts all last year. For context, the Broncos, where Thomas used to play, had 106 red zone pass attempts. I admit things change. Maybe I'm way underestimating Blake Bortles' capacity to grow in year 2 of his career. I sure didn't see it from him last year on tape. He made terrible decisions, had spotty throwing accuracy. I'm okay with Thomas as a top 10 fantasy tight end, but he's part of that vast middle class. I don't need to reach for him. I'm not taking him in the 6th round. If I can get him in the 9th or 10th, which I'm not going to, it seems like, because some folks think he's a sleeper in the 6th, that's fine. I just don't imagine that in that offense, outside of Mercedes Lewis randomly scoring a whole bunch of accidental touchdowns in the red zone and not having a lot of receptions, I just don't see a huge ceiling. Number 3, Steve Smith, the Ravens receiver. He announced Monday that 2015 will be his final season, and on average, we see him going 8th or 9th rounds in a 12-team draft, kind of a valedictory lap or something like that. People think, hey, Smitty finished as fantasy's number 20 wide receiver last year. Torrey Smith is gone. Ravens didn't replace him, at least with any proven commodities. They've got a rookie tight end also. How does Steve Smith not make up whatever he lacks in speed at age 36 just with sheer volume? I guess that's what people are thinking. Listen, in his final year in Carolina, I thought Smith looked absolutely disinterested and absolutely cooked, and I said so all last summer, and then Smith opened up the year with 400-yard receiving games and 4 touchdowns in his first 6 contests. It's possible to believe that the change of scenery had rejuvenated him or something. Unfortunately, his legs went away again later in the year, and his game tape at the end of 14 looked just like his game tape at the end of 13. And I'm not a believer. I guess there's a chance, and there's a chance with all these guys. I'm not trying to pick players who are completely irrelevant for fantasy. I'm trying to pick guys who I don't particularly love, but I admit there's obviously a chance that I'm wrong on any of them. I say there's a chance that Smith does the same thing, gets off to a hot start this year, sets you up with a few early wins. But in rounds where, I could be grabbing young players with upside, I could be getting his teammate, Rashad Perryman, as long as Perryman winds up, practicing in some point in August. That would be nice. I'm not interested in taking retirees with very little upside. Next up, I've certainly seen Reggie Bush's name on some sleeper lists. The logic goes, Bush joins a 49ers team that just shed itself of Frank Gore, only has unproven Carlos Hyde on the depth chart ahead of him. If and when San Fran needs to go spread or hurry up or catch up, Bush should be on the field, right, in those situations. And why can't he duplicate one of those 50-catch, 1,000 total yard seasons he's had in the past? And hey, in a point per reception, he's even better, right? Listen, I'm not going to deny that there's some logic to that. Bush is just barely inside my top 40 running backs in a point per reception league. But I just have a hard time picturing him, staying healthy if he gets big usage, right? I mean, he's played the full 16 once since his rookie year. Worse than that, though, the tape from last year, just an obvious downgrade from last season with the Lions. He was really slow. I don't know, maybe slow isn't the way of putting it. And it could have been injuries, I admit it. But there's some straightforward acceleration, but there wasn't much of that jitterbug, make you miss side-to-side stuff that we remember from Reggie Bush. It was gone, gone, gone. He was tackleable in a way that in the past I haven't seen him be tackleable. And could it have been health? It absolutely could have. And I'm not trying to say he's not draftable, but I don't know. Even if he winds up being a higher floor player in a point per reception, even with 50 catches, I don't see anything close to 1,000 total yards because I just don't know how much actual running he's going to do. And I think that Carlos Hyde is the obvious candidate for whatever rushing touchdowns the 49ers are able to muster. Finally, I know folks want Victor Cruz to come back. I know there's been a relentless stream of positive stories about him coming out of Giants camp. And listen, I want to be wrong on Victor Cruz. I'm literally sitting here doing this show from Amherst, Mass. Cruz went to UMass. I have literally no stake in throwing cold water on his comeback from a torn patellar tendon. But I get so many questions on Twitter at Harris Football that are like, Odell Beckham has to take back this year, man, because they'll have a healthy Victor Cruz, right, man? I don't know why I'm saying man. I'm not sure why surfers are tweeting fantasy questions to me. But anyway, maybe you never rule out medical science. It's possible. I didn't think I was going to bet on Adrian Peterson coming off the torn ACL, and he nearly set a rushing record, right? But this is a bad injury. This is a crippling injury for wide receivers, the torn patellar tendon. Good receivers in the recent past, like Austin Collie, Mark Clayton, David Boston, had their careers ruined by this injury. They were not able to come back after surgery. The only guy I could find going pretty far back to come back from this injury at receiver was actually Robert Brooks, and you got to assume that medical science is better now, but actually that was before the turn of the century. He became comeback player of the year after this injury, but eventually he had a lot of knee pain and retired early. On average, Victor Cruz is going 35th among wide receivers right now, and that puts him in the top 100 overall on average. Boy, I don't see that. I want to be wrong. I want to be wrong on all these guys. I even want to be wrong on LeGarrette Blount. I don't wish failure on anybody, but these are probably. I'm not going to be rooting for failure on these players, but these are probably 5 guys that I'm just not going to take part in this year.
Tweet of the day.
First, I should mention the rather haunting, endearing, and yes, I'll say disturbing artwork submitted to us by @DryEraseGirl, our friend Viola J. A visual homage to the little podcast that could. And I encourage you to follow @DryEraseGirl. You can also follow me @Harris Football. I retweeted this insane childhood nightmare which made me laugh very hard. But that is not actually the tweet of the day. The tweet of the day comes from Thomas Morgan, who retweeted Philip Jankowski, who had some breaking news. Breaking: suspect in stabbings that killed 1 and injured 2 near Pflugerville on Friday, charged with murder. Name is Christopher L. Harris, 28. As has been the case with all of the sightings that you guys have been sending me, it wasn't me. First of all, middle initial P, not L. Second of all, the age, very flattering. That's not quite my age, but I am very flattered by that. So no, none of these, darn it, you people, none of these sightings have been me. Really. I swear. Not me.
Today's guest.
And today's guest is one of the primary play-by-play voices of the UFC. He's Jon Anik. You can follow him on Twitter at Jon_Anik. He's a good friend of mine. He's also the co-host of the Anik and Florian Podcast, an MMA special. Jon, thank you for doing this. How are you?
I am doing well, man, and I have to congratulate you on the new venture off the top, because I remember in 2008 when you told me you watched every snap of every NFL game on NFL.com. And I was like, wait, what is that? You watch every, and you've always been the number one fantasy football guy in the space. And to have your own platform like this, I think is very exciting. So thank you for having me on, and congratulations on getting this thing off the ground.
Thank you very much. And, Jon's my first broadcast partner at ESPN. We did a Sunday morning show. It was on .com for, was it 2 or 3 years?
I think it was 3 seasons.
Yeah, and we did a bunch of right when the podcast stuff was starting at ESPN, we did podcasts together. We were from the same town. I mean, come on,
a lot of similarities.
How simpatico are we? The only similarity that we don't share, the only thing we don't have in common, is that I did not win La Liga Lebowski last year, and Mr. Anik did. How does it feel to be the defending champion?
Well, I feel fortunate because I am in a league with a bunch of fantasy heads that are 30 times smarter than me and ingest a lot more of this stuff. But, as I've always said, you and I do not like fantasy baseball. When I played fantasy baseball, I did so just as a means by which to still pay attention to what the hell was going on.
Yeah.
But I did always say I thought there was a little bit more skill in fantasy baseball than fantasy football. I mean, there's just only so much that you can do from a weekly standpoint, picking guys up. From a draft standpoint, if your guys get injured in fantasy football, you're not going to win a title. And you got bit by that injury bug last year, and my team stayed healthy. I mean, I did not have a single injury to my core lineup, and I tweaked here and there, but I felt more fortunate than I did skill to win the La Liga Lebowski, that's for sure.
I may have also been bitten by one Adrian Peterson, but we shouldn't rehash old wounds, frankly. So, folks who aren't up to speed on what we're talking about, La Liga Lebowski is a dynasty league that Jon and I are both in, and I talked about it at length, what the rules are, in last Friday's show, if you want to check that out. But suffice it to say that it is a fairly complex league. Player contracts, salary cap penalties for dropping guys, franchise tags, player holdouts. What was it like to be in that auction room knowing that the pressure is on you to repeat?
Oh, gosh. It's funny. I kind of felt the opposite way. I said to my wife, I beat these guys that I had no business beating last year.
So humble.
But it's the truth, man, So I felt like if I could beat Christopher Harris in one fantasy league in my lifetime, then I'm doing something right. So I actually felt like the pressure was off. So going in there this year, one of the things strategically that I always try to get away from, and it's a little bit harder in dynasty leagues, but is to not own the same guys the next year after you own them, because I do expect Des Bryant to come back to the pack a little bit. I'm not sure that Romo's going to stay healthy and they're going to be as good a 1-2 punch as they were last year. So going in this year, I actually wanted to get a quarterback and not put all my eggs in the Romo Des Bryant basket. So I went in there. Peyton Manning was my number one goal. I think Tom Brady fired him up, gave him some extra motivation, and was happy to land Peyton Manning for $71.
And we should say, when we talk about dollar values, this is with a salary cap of $900, something like that. So 71 isn't quite as outlandish as someone might think when they first hear that number. This podcast tomorrow on Wednesday is going to have a full episode devoted totally to auctions, and Andy Behrens, who's also in La Liga, will be the guest. But we can kind of get a jump on it here. So obviously this in particular is an auction where teams are coming in with wildly varying rosters, right? Some folks had a ton of money, but not that many players. Some folks the other way around. But I'm kind of thinking, just in general about auctions, what's your strategy? What does that tend to be when the fireworks are going off and people are spending big dollars right away?
You know, I usually bow out, and last night, and I'm not just saying this because it was your team, but I thought Brandon Marshall at $51 was the best value play through the entire draft. Now, you go in with $416 and change, right? A lot of us go in with $150 or so. So it's very different, I think, than a lot of traditional auction leagues because we're all starting at a different spot, you know? Right. And I felt like people last night were not getting super aggressive early. I think it's why I was able to get Peyton Manning for $71 when, you know, Matt Ryan and Joe Flacco went very similarly priced, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours later. It's why you were able to get Brandon Marshall for $51, and I paid almost as much for Marvin Jones 2 hours later, you know? So I tend to be a little too conservative early.
Well, and, you know, what's interesting is, you know, LaShawn McCoy, I think, was the first guy off the board, went for like $120. Right. And then Brandon Marshall might have been the second, and he went for like $51. And listen, you know, Brandon Marshall's fine. He might be the number 25 receiver for me, something like that. And then Randall Cobb might have been the next player or the player after that. And that was the one where things went crazy and the fireworks really started.
Right.
He goes for over $200. Now, Cobb was the only top 10 guy who was in this auction. All the rest of them were kept in this Dynasty League, already owned. But 4 times what Marshall went for. And I think this is interesting because for me, I don't think that's wrong. You know, obviously in the draft chat room, we were all, you know, making fun of everybody for betting $200 for Randall Cobb. But the thing about auctions, and the reason why I'm reluctant to give default dollar values, is that it's not in a vacuum. You know, you can't really look at it and say, why is the league valuing Cobb 4 times what they're valuing Marshall? No, it was just a situation where there's some scarcity. He's the best player at his position. There are people with a lot of money in this particular auction. It's what the market would bear. So I'm not saying it was right to spend that money on Cobb, but I don't say it was wrong either. This is sort of the Adam Smith, you know, the hand of the market.
Yeah. No, and I would say, too, that the truly elite guys, you know, Marshawn Lynch, Randall Cobb, they're still going to get top dollar. But, you know, relative to guys like Brandon Marshall and Peyton Manning, maybe in a second or tertiary tier, I just thought there was a huge discrepancy. I mean, Marshawn Lynch, to me, is so due for a down year at this point in time. And the fact that he went for nearly twice what LaShawn McCoy went for, to me, is just crazy. I understand, you know, systems play a role, you know, cold weather potentially. People think maybe McCoy is now, you know, on the, you know, downside of his prime. I don't agree with that necessarily. But, yeah, I think in short of the elite guys, you know, I think that there was a drop-off money-wise. I was really disappointed to not get Brandon Marshall, but I didn't think he would go off the board at 51 beans, you know?
Yeah, and, well, you know, and I think that's a mistake that folks make in auctions is this notion of the market being set by a player. Okay, that, you know, that player is now the stake in the ground around which all the bidding must go. And I think there's a tendency to do that, and that's, you know, why the big sites put out dollar values, you know, for default. This is what this guy is worth. I don't think these things take place in a vacuum. You know, these things take place in light of the other guys who've gone, and yet, you know, one more good guy is gone. So by the time Marshawn Lynch is up for auction, most of the elite running backs are gone. There are still teams sitting there with money. Well, you know what? He's going to go for a lot more than players of comparable ability might have gone, and that's okay.
Right, and on your roster, you spent $72, I believe, on Charles Johnson.
Right, and only $51 on Marshall, right.
Right,
yeah.
And thankfully those two guys don't know it. I know, as you said in the chat room, there'd be some friction there, but that's sort of the way it goes, and I think that you just have to be very aware that that's the way it's going to go. I think next year, if I were to do something differently, I would just not be afraid to be aggressive early, because, you know, now I'm sitting here, you know, Monday morning quarterback, I got $90 left, and that easily could have been spent on a guy like Brandon Marshall or Rashad Jennings, you know.
Yeah, you mentioned Jennings. Along those lines, you and I battled very late in the auction for Rashad Jennings. He was pretty much at that point clearly the best player left on the board by a pretty wide margin. I mean, I already had running backs, I already had holdovers. Jonathan Stewart, Latavius Murray, Gio Bernard are all on my team. It's not the perfect backfield, but for a league this deep, it's not terrible. And I was just sitting on a mountain of cap space. I didn't see a lot of other guys to spend it on. I needed receivers, but most of the receivers were gone. So you and I just bid up Jennings like crazy. He wound up almost at $100.
Right.
Now, remember, that's, again, for a cap that's $900 this season, so it's not quite as much as it sounds. I probably don't even really have an obvious spot for him. So in a vacuum, again, I spent too much in a vacuum. But in the end, it's what the market would bear. If Jennings stays healthy, I probably have a trade market for him.
No doubt about it. And I don't have a number 2 running back right now. You know what I mean? So I couldn't afford I didn't have nearly as much cash going in last night. So had I, continued to bid up with Rashad Jennings, and I know you're going to make me pay for him, I couldn't go beyond $100 because then I would have had, $27 left. So the result is that I go into week 1 with Alfred Blue as my number 2 running back. And I got CJ Spiller and Duke Johnson. I was able to get D'Angelo Williams late. So, maybe if something happens with Le'Veon Bell, there's some value there. But I now have a glaring hole in that number 2 running back slot. Because I needed to save money to, add depth at wide receiver, add a backup tight end. So I couldn't pull the trigger at that number, and just knowing that Christopher Harris was the guy I was bidding against, I had to bow out. But, I was hoping actually to make a trade for him at some point in the next week or so, because he is a player that I did go in targeting. The price just got too steep.
What we'll do is, offline, we'll stay recording, and we'll just record our negotiation session. I'm sure that America and the world will be thrilled to hear that.
They would love it.
Yeah. You talked about you knew I was going to bid you up, right? And there's a lot of that going on in all auctions. This is not specific to ours. There is a feeling sometimes, I know I have it a lot, like I don't think we've reached the point where the market really should be on that price, not on that guy. Not necessarily that isn't a fair value, because again, I don't really get into fair value. It's more like I bet you the market will bear more than we're at right now. And I find myself bidding on players I don't necessarily want.
Yeah.
Right? Just because I think the market will bear more, I think I'll get outbid. And that happened a bunch last night. I mean, we had that crazy moment where the Rams defense, most defenses are going for between, the good ones are going between $10 and $15 in this league, which again is pretty small compared to the salary cap. And suddenly the Rams go bananas, maybe the last good defense on the board. Joe Flacco, you mentioned earlier, same thing. He was maybe the last decent backup quarterback on the board. And I found myself hitting bid, because I could tell people would go higher, and it's to my advantage to have money come off the board. You're always scared you're going to get stuck with a guy you don't necessarily want. Do you find yourself doing that in auctions? Do you think that's good strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I find myself doing a lot of things that maybe I wouldn't do if I was in a different type of league. But again, I don't just say this because I'm on your podcast, but I feel like this is a league where I'm, forced to play up to my competition. So I think it does affect my strategy a little bit. I mean, the Rams defense last night, for those of you that don't know, went for $41. About an hour prior, I got the Dolphins defense for $3 because nobody was really in any panic zone when it came to staffing a defense. Now, do I expect the Rams unit to be better than the Miami unit? Yes, I do. But, Delaney Walker, you've got him as a top 11 tight end. I got him for $14. Your number 24 tight end, Josh Hill, goes for 3 times the price, $43, before we're about to close the room down. So I think sometimes you just have to be careful waiting too long, because you do get burned and you have to overpay. It happened to me a lot more last year than this year. But again, I really feel like a lot of guys sit back, and bide their time early, and more often than not, it's a general thesis statement, but you do end up paying for it.
Very interesting. So here's a sort of player-specific thought that I noticed on looking at your roster afterwards, that you wound up taking both Marvin Jones and Mohamed Sanu.
Right.
I wondered if that meant you had any secret misgivings about A.J. Green this year.
Well, I had any guy who has had any sort of injury history, even Randall Cobb, I'm not going near him at $200. There's just no way. The way he's built, the way he gives up his body over the middle, it just scares me. So there are certain guys that I won't even touch from an injury standpoint. I know you well enough to know that you pick up Andy Dalton's weapons at your own peril. You and I are not fans of Andy Dalton at all, and that gives me a little bit of pause. But yes, that was something strategically that I went in trying to get Mohamed Sanu. You know, I used to do some college football play-by-play for ESPN, and one of the games I did, Mohamed Sanu blew up. So I was surprised my New England Patriots didn't draft him and left him on the board for several. I was really surprised at how much Sanu's stock dropped going into that draft, and obviously I haven't been surprised with his production. I think he really is a stud. But yeah, why did I end up paying double what I paid for Sanu for Marvin Jones? Because I didn't want to get burned in a scenario whereby Marvin Jones was the more productive guy behind AJ Green. So I felt like I had to overpay for Marvin Jones a little bit to get both of those guys, and I'm going to be forced to start at least one of them every week. So that was really the strategy, I think, to get Cincinnati's unquestioned number 2 guy more than it was forecasting anything negative for AJ Green.
Okay, and well, so yeah, we should just mention you don't actually have AJ Green, so this isn't a handcuff situation. This is actually thinking about the number 2 and or inheriting the job if the unthinkable happens to Green. In fact, in general, looking at your roster, you may be reaching the end of an era with this title team.
Yep.
You have a couple. You mentioned Dez. You have Dez longer term. You have Matt Forte longer term, which may or may not be a good thing in the case of Forte because he turns 30. But you have Romo, Antonio Brown, Keenan Allen, Greg Olsen, all entering the last years of their contracts, and only Keenan Allen can actually be extended. The others you've all already extended, and in this league you can only do one contract extension. This is kind of more of a general dynasty question that we can look at through the lens of your team right now, but how do you kind of marshal your forces for the sense that, okay, this might be the end for this particular group in my dynasty team?
Well, I know NFL teams don't rest on their laurels, but I do have to say, it's so hard to win a fantasy championship, especially in a 12 or 14 team league. So the fact that we got that title, the fact that I'm staring at this championship belt right now, makes things a little bit easier, But that was really behind the strategy to get Peyton Manning. Even though I don't expect him to play more than 3 more seasons, I actually think, even though Tom Brady's comments, I think, were largely innocuous, I think it will serve as some motivation for Peyton Manning to maybe try to extend his career a year or so. So the other thing, too, as I said off the top, the Romo-Dez Bryant combination, as much as it won a title for me, it does scare me. So Romo's actually going to be the backup this season. Peyton Manning's going to be the starter, and hopefully Peyton Manning will be the starter for 3 years. I've always been somebody who has overinvested in a top quarterback, and I don't put Peyton Manning in the class with Aaron Rodgers and Andrew Luck. I really don't, going into 2015. But he was a target of mine because I thought he would be a little bit undervalued, and he was a guy who I wanted to aesthetically look at the top of my roster for the next 2 or 3 years. So at least at the quarterback position, I feel like I put myself in a position to withstand the loss of Tony Romo. As far as the running backs are concerned, I'm in trouble. I mean, that's what's going to be our big investment next year because, short of Matt Forte, there's just the cupboard's bare, dude. I mean, and that's why a guy like Rashad Jennings had a lot of value to me. But again, when I look at other rosters and I look at the wide receiver depth, to have Antonio Brown and Dez Bryant, even for 1 season, makes me feel like at least I've done something right.
Sure.
So, I guess, in a long-winded way to answer your question, I can't look too far ahead. Because ultimately I'm just trying to focus on 2015. Dude, we're just trying to defend this title, dude. That's all we're trying to do.
And when Peyton Manning is your bridge, right? The 73-year-old, he's my bridge to the future.
I hope Andy Barron's his team is like AARP, so hopefully he'll have a lot to say on that tomorrow with you.
So it's interesting. I mean, if you're in a dynasty league and you have a team like we're describing where it might be older or maybe very expensive or, a lot of keepers who for whatever reason in your league can't continue to be kept, what's interesting is that it sort of opens up the possibility, all right, let's see how it goes to start the year. Yeah. But if it doesn't go well, if by mid-October I don't feel like this is a contending team, what's great about a dynasty league is the season isn't over. Now you can really talk about building for the future. You've got a ton of amazing trade chips. Sure, they're not going to be multi-year keepers for whoever you trade them to, but you can get rookie draft picks. You can get, cheap younger players off of other rosters who you can have under control for multiple years. It's part of the magic of any dynasty league is just getting those teams that are kind of at cross purposes, right? People with different agendas and different goals, you can have kind of those ultimate win-win trades.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the rookie draft that we do in early May, I think really is a cornerstone for success in La Liga. I've only had, I think, one rookie, Keenan Allen, who has really contributed in 3 or 4 of these rookie drafts. But when you think about some guys who score like an Odell Beckham Jr. Or some of these other studs that just immediately start to contribute, I think those are the guys that end up having more longer-term success.
Yeah,
I haven't drafted particularly well when it comes to the rookie draft. I will say, I have twice finished as the runner-up in this league, and I have won 1 title. So
you're dominant, man.
Well, but in 3 of the 4 years, I'm drafting, and it's not a snake draft in the rookie draft,
right.
So so I'm getting, pick number 11 and then pick number 22. So, you got Amari Cooper.
Heavy is the head that wears the crown. That's a tough job for you, man.
Well, hey, but when you look at my rookies, dude, I mean, if you didn't know that I was picking second to last or last in the last 3 years, you would think that I really don't do my homework for those rookie drafts. I mean, Johnny Manziel, who I cut, was my number 1 pick in the rookie draft last year because the cupboard was pretty bare. I mean, you add a guy like Amari Cooper, who seems to be as close to a slam dunk as we've had for an incoming wide receiver in years. That's really going to buoy you guys this year. So I think the rookie draft is a little bit underrated when it comes to long-term success, at least the way our league structure is set up. And at least for me, it hasn't always necessarily worked out. I wanted to ask you one other question, just in terms of the quarterbacks that went last night. It seemed like you didn't want to go anywhere near Peyton Manning. And after Peyton Manning, 3 guys who went in a similar price range, $15 or $20 less, Joe Flacco, Matt Ryan, Sam Bradford. So of those 4 quarterbacks, Peyton, Flacco, Matt Ryan, Sam Bradford, did you have any interest in any one of the 4 going in last night?
I have interest in any player at the right price. But at the prices that they all went, probably not. Manning would have been the one I would have been most interested in. And in light of the fact that I did carry a lot of money out of, I have a lot of cap room to make trades for this season, it was a price that probably would have been worth paying. I'm not sure how many years I would want him for. I'm not sure I'm as optimistic about beyond 2015 as you are.
Sure.
Matt Ryan, I think probably it was about a right price for him too, and I would have been interested in him as well. Flacco and Bradford, not so much. I wasn't ever going to take them, but what's funny is to watch me bid on Flacco, you never would have thought that was the case because I probably submitted the most bids on Flacco as we were bidding it up, and it's not because I wanted him at all. I was really hoping I wasn't going to get stuck with him. I wanted them to bleed a little bit for me.
You made him bleed, for sure. So, but obviously you were content going into this season with Ryan Tannehill and not much else if you're not able to make a move.
Right, yeah. I went into the draft for sure thinking, okay, in a deep league like this, it's 12 teams, but it's 26-man rosters. I'm going to go in with Tannehill as my starter. Yeah. All right, John. Well, we could probably talk about our league forever and ever. I hope folks are feeling like they can take some general auction feelings away from our conversation.
Yeah, I always find it interesting, especially being in a league with guys who do this for a living that I can even compete. But I do get a little bit intimidated on auction night, I'm not going to lie to you.
No reason to be intimidated by me, my friend. I believe I was picking first in the rookie draft. Although I didn't finish with the worst record. I won the draft lottery under very suspicious circumstances. Obviously.
That was real shady, dude.
Highly
shady.
Suspicious. All right, John. Thank you very much for doing this. You're one of the main guys who calls fights for UFC. On Twitter, you are at Jon_Anik. And, of course, the Anik and Florian podcast. It's the must-listen among podcasts in the MMA world. You're a gentleman and a scholar and a very, very good friend, and thanks a lot for doing this.
My pleasure, man. Congrats on everything. Look forward to listening.
And that is our show. You can expect some more auction talk on Wednesday. Andy Behrens of Yahoo Fantasy will be here. We'll talk a little more generally about auctions. I'm sure a little La Liga talk will slip in there, but mostly we want to help you do well in your auctions and have a good perspective. So that'll be Wednesday. Hey, subscribe to the show by whatever mechanism you subscribe. It helps us out a lot. Hopefully you can catch up on all the shows that way. And again, this has been amazing. It's the little podcast that could, and it's really because of all of you. Thank you so much for listening, and we will talk to you tomorrow.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.